Hi everyone. So your second lesson for spring break is going to be on communism spreading in Asia. We start off with China. In China, there was previous to World War II a civil war with communist versus nationalist forces fighting for control. The leaders of these were Mao Zedong for the communists and Chiang Kai-shek for the nationalist forces. The civil war paused briefly during World War II. Because they had a common enemy, the Japanese. But once the World War was over, um, the nationalists and the communists began fighting again. Nationalists started to lose American support due to poor leadership, and so the communists were able to take control, and Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China, also known as the PRC, in 1949. Um, this is going to be very frightening for the United States because China is then going to turn to a very close neighbor, Russia, the Soviet Union, who is also a communist country. They signed a treaty of friendship in 1950, and so the United States has now lost its main ally in Asia. The United States did not recognize communist China as true leadership. We only recognized the nationalist forces that had moved into Taiwan. And so there was a major problem on the UN because the Soviet Union and China were boycotting the UN because the United States did not recognize the PRC. Problem for them, though, is that by boycotting the UN, they don't get that veto power by being on the Security Council. So because we lost our major ally in Asia, we need a new one. And so we focus on improving our relationship with Japan. And from then on out, they are going to be our main ally in Asia. From here, we look at the Korean War, which is known as the Forgotten War, partially because it's such a short war. It only lasts from 1950 to 1953, but also because it is bookended by two major wars, by World War II and by the Vietnam War. So how this begins is actually due to World War II. In World War II, Japan invaded Korea, and when the war was over, the United States and the Soviet Union decided that we would divide Korea into two sections, where they would be divided at the 38th parallel, basically cutting it straight in half. We would divide it, rebuild it, and eventually reunify. The northern part was backed by the communist Soviet Union. The southern democratic half was backed by the United States. However, although this seemed like a great idea, in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with the intention of reunifying the country under a communist government. This was a major problem for the United States. We did not want yet another country in Asia to fall to communism. And so we sent in our forces along with the United Nations forces under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. Excuse me. This is going to be the very beginnings of the Korean War. So North Korea is going to go in and they are going to take over the entire peninsula except for a small region known as Pusan, where when you see this little animation start over again, right here is where you see that taking over. So when that happens, MacArthur launches a surprise attack and is actually able to push the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. But then he actually makes the decision to actually enter into North Korean territory and push the North Korean army all the way back to the Yalu River, which is on the Chinese border, which you will see right here. This is going to be making China very nervous, and so China pushes back, sending troops in to aid the North Koreans, push the UN forces back across the 38th parallel back into South Korea, which you see here. And so the fighting is going to go back and forth across the 38th parallel for 3 years. General Douglas MacArthur was kind of sick and tired of this whole thing. And so he called for a nuclear attack on China when they invaded into North Korea. He says to Truman, we need to do this to show them that we mean business, that we're not going to put up with this kind of stuff. Truman disagreed, saying that MacArthur's proposal was reckless. He said, we are trying to prevent a world war, not to start one. MacArthur made a bad move, and he actually went above Truman's head. He went and took his case to Congress. He took his case to the press and basically called Truman a wuss for not wanting to nuke the Chinese. And Truman was thus forced to fire him for insubordination because the president is the commander in chief. So he basically made fun of his boss in public, and that's a gigantic no-no. So the war ends in July of 1953. The UN forces in North Korea signed a ceasefire agreement. After 3 years of fighting, the border between North and South Korea was divided, and it was pretty much almost exactly at the 38th parallel again. This was now renamed as a demilitarized zone, also known as the DMZ. The idea is that nobody owns this particular stretch of land. It is going to be a narrow strip that served as a buffer zone between North and South Korea. And although it is called the demilitarized zone, it is actually the most heavily militarized border in the world and probably the most dangerous location on the planet. It is covered with thousands of military on both sides, landmines, electric wire, etc. The Korean War is significant, although it is a short war and it ends pretty much exactly where it started. It's still significant for two main reasons. Number one, it is important because it was the very first time that the Cold War had spread beyond Europe. And two, it was the first time that the Cold War became militarized. It was not economic, where we're giving money so that someone doesn't become communist. It's not political, where we're putting pressure on them to not become communist. We literally sent in young men to die for this. Over 5 million soldiers and civilians died within this war, and all for it to end virtually where it began. So what happens to North and South Korea afterwards? Well, South Korea after the war struggled politically for a while. Where you see right here is actually the capital city of Seoul. South Korea didn't do very well after the war, but once it established a democratic government in 1987, it began to skyrocket. They got very heavy into technology, and they now have one of the fastest growing economies in the entire world. The United States still maintains military presence, especially at the DMZ, and we have Army and Air Force personnel there to basically help South Korea defend itself against external aggression because North Korea still wants to reunify the peninsula. So what happens in North Korea? Well, North Korea is going to be led by this guy, Kim Il-sung. He takes over when the war is over. Actually, he's the leader during the war. But he is now the leader of North Korea, the individual country, in 1953. He is going to do what pretty much every other communist leader first does, which he establishes collective farms. He develops heavy industry. He built up the country's military power. These are things that every communist country has done. China did it, Soviet Union did it. So he's not reinventing the wheel. But something that is unique to North Korea is that he created what is known as a cult of personality. He created it where he basically became the god of the country. He is known as the dear leader, and he is still, even though he has died, technically the leader of North Korea. He is the leader for all eternity in North Korea. When he died, his son, Kim Jong-il, took over in 1994. This is the very first time that there has been a dynastic handing over of power in a communist nation. No other communist nation did that. They did have technical elections, per se, or someone would assume power, but this is the first time that it's actually happened within a single family. Now, Kim Jong-il goes one step further than his father, not just establishing and building up the country's military power and continuing on with the cult of domesticity, the cult of personality, but he then goes on to develop nuclear weapons. He wants to be a huge nuclear power in the world. He died in 2011, and his son, Kim Jong-un, ascended to power. Kim Jong-un is interesting because although North Korea is completely cut off from the rest of the world, Kim Jong-un actually attended school in Switzerland in a democratic, capitalistic society. He loves basketball. He's BFF with Dennis Rodman now. Um, but although we hoped that his experience and exposure to the West would make him more friendly to the West, he's very desperate to live up to the expectations of his father and grandfather. And so he has actually attempted to launch ICBMs and launch nuclear missiles against South Korea. Now, if you guys remember this going on, it was last year. The thing was is that the weapons that he was launching, the first one didn't even get off the launch pad. It just exploded where it sat. Another one launched and then blew up in midair. A third one launched and landed in the ocean somewhere. The thing is that although they keep threatening the United States and threatening South Korea, their weaponry is nowhere near our weaponry. And unfortunately, for them, if they did want to have a nuclear war, the only country that they are friends with that has nuclear power is China, and China has vowed to stay out of it. So, what is life like in North Korea? It's not that good. This is their capital city of Pyongyang, as opposed to the capital city of South Korea, that is so technologically advanced and looks like New York City. This is what it looks like in North Korea. It's dirty, it is run down, it is a third world country. They don't have the infrastructure to survive. This is the North Korean, this is Korea, the Korean peninsula at night. And if you look down here, you can see the South Korean peninsula. You can see Seoul very clearly. But the rest of North Korea, you can't hardly see. And that's because they don't really have the infrastructure to have consistent light. You can see Pyongyang right there, but it is almost impossible to see because they don't have enough power to keep consistent light. They have rolling blackouts. They don't have medical technology like we do. The people of their country many times are starving because they don't have any outside allies. They have very few countries that they even trade with because they have this belief that they don't need anybody else, that they will be self-sufficient. The DMZ today is still, like I said, the most militarized and probably the most dangerous place on the planet. This is looking from the North Korean side to the South Korean side. Um, this is actually on one of the border lines where we have actually set up locations for communication between North and South. These bunkers that you see on either side are actually meeting rooms that are designed so that we can have meetings between North and South. However, those meetings are very few and far between because North Korea does not want to talk to South Korea. Now, the soldiers that you see right here, the soldier that you see facing you is making sure that nobody tries to run across and jump over that little concrete border into South Korea and into freedom. They are not allowed to leave their country without permission, and very few are even given that permission. The two soldiers that are standing there facing each other are also to stop anyone who tries to run across the border. But part of the reason why there's two of them and they're facing each other is so that neither one of them is tempted to step across that small concrete barrier. So if you want to wrap it up in a nutshell, North Korea, all hail the dear leader, everyone joins the military, and South Korea, well, you guys know how it goes. So I'll see you guys later for your third lesson.